Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 37, Athens. 11,000 years ago, when humanity was young, a great empire emerged from an island in the Atlantic Ocean. Named after the great titan Atlas, this empire of Atlantis stretched deep into Europe, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, enslaving and conquering all to satisfy their tremendous greed. It seemed as if nothing could stop this onslaught, yet just when all was feared lost, the city-state of Athens, located in eastern Greece, gathered up allies to make a stand. The fighting raged on. Even after their allies, the other Greek cities, abandoned the resistance. But the Athenians persevered against the Atlanteans, finally defeating their armies and liberating a grateful Egypt. Shortly after, a powerful earthquake struck down Atlantis, destroying the island and sinking it beneath the waves. It is said that it was punishment from the gods for their sinful ways. Or at least that's what Plato claimed, and even his contemporaries were arching their collective eyebrows at this, wondering if their esteemed teacher was completely off his rocker. And while plate tectonics has pretty much proved that no island the size of Libya ever existed off the coast of Spain, this story perfectly encapsulates how the Athenians viewed themselves, the true champions of Greek culture and ideals. What, you'd rather have Sparta in charge, with their slaves and their weird sadist cheese rituals? You know you want the freedom that democracy offers, and if you didn't know that, then it's time you were educated through force by Zeus. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. After all, Athens is a very old city, and before those halcyon days of democracy, philosophy, and hemlock tea, there was a city near a hill, shrouded in myth and ruled by kings. The old legends state that the first king was the demigod Cecrops, who was commonly depicted as being a serpent from the waist down. I'm going to say it's for that reason why historians don't like to believe he exists. Well, it's under his reign that Athena and Poseidon supposedly held a contest for who would be patron god of this yet unnamed city. Poseidon created a saltwater spring and the first horse, sort of a mixed bag, but Athena offered an olive tree, far more useful and tasty, and thus she won. The city is renamed Athens, and for hundreds of years a series of semi-mythical kings ruled, including the slayer of the Minotaur, Theseus. He is also responsible for spreading Athenian culture and values throughout Attica, so that every village and town in the region identified themselves as Athenian. Mycenaean Athens later participated in the Trojan War, and was the only city to successfully withstand the Dorian invasion, although at a heavy price. The Oracle of Delphi predicted that the only way Athens would fall was if the king remained unharmed. So Codros, the current king of Athens, disguised himself as a peasant, made his way into the Dorian camp, and provoked a group of soldiers into attacking and killing him. His true identity as king revealed in death, the Dorians feared that the gods would now deny them victory, and they left the city unscathed. Codros' sacrifice inspired the Athenians to completely abolish the monarchy, as they believed no one could ever match such nobility. Instead of a single king, they would split the position into three roles. The archon Basileus would be responsible for religious matters, the polemarch would lead the military, and the eponymous archon, the political and legislative head. This last position also had the honor of getting to lend his name to the year, sort of a neat little bonus. That word, archon, by the way, means ruler, and also applies to a group of 6 men below these 3, for a total of 9 archons controlling the government. But it doesn't stop there, because below these lawmakers were various councils and offices, including the Assembly, a group open to free men 20 years of age, and the Areopagus, a ruling body made up of retired archons who advised the current archons on laws and government matters. Not very democratic, you're thinking, right? Nope, the early system was amazingly complex and overtly favored the wealthiest citizens. As an archon, you didn't want to stir the pot too much because you wanted to have a comfortable retirement, right? Still, despite this system, or maybe because of it, Athens was mostly stable and successful in the centuries following the Dorian invasion. While the rest of Greece went through their dark ages, struggling to rebuild their societies, life went on pretty uninterrupted for the Athenians, specifically a mostly agricultural life. At this time, there was plenty of land in Attica, and while the soil wasn't good for much, it adequately supported the population, with enough food left over to export, and really good clay for pottery. Yet as the population increased and arable land became harder to claim, the poorest farmers struggled to produce a surplus off the land. When times were bad, they turned to their richer neighbors for support. They would borrow seeds to plant and plow in their own plot, and then come harvest time return the loan with food and part-time work on the neighbor's farm. Now this is a fine system as long as everyone's satisfied using food and labor as currency. But towards the end of the 7th century, the Lydian invention of money had arrived in Greece, and boy did it shake things up. The friendly seed-borrowing way of life was abandoned for something more profitable. So let's say that same poor farmer needs a bag of seed. Okay, the wealthy neighbor now agrees to loan the seed for an agreed-upon future price of the fully grown grain. Let's say 5 gold coins, whatever. But suppose the farmer has a bad harvest, or the price of grain has dropped, and they can only get about 2 gold coins for it. Well, when that neighbor comes to collect and the money isn't there, the poor farmer has few options available to him. He might be able to work off the debt, if he's lucky, but most likely his own farm would be seized, or even worse, he and his family might become slaves. Legally, there was nothing they could do. After all, the same wealthiest citizens benefiting from this law were the ones enforcing it. You could even be sold and sent throughout the Mediterranean, and this is where the law really rubbed people the wrong way. Slavery is one thing. Oh, sure, no one's saying that's a bad thing. But the enslavement of fellow Athenians? What are we, a bunch of Spartans? Oh yes, many agreed the laws were wrong and needed to change. But who would step up to do so? The first lawmaker on record is Draco, around 620 BC. The term draconian originates from him, and that should give you an idea what kind of laws he promulgated. Most of his reforms dealt with murder and crime, and most of the punishments involved execution for the offender, even for simple crimes like stealing a loaf of bread. When asked why death was appropriate for such a wide range of offenses, a quote attributed to him reads like this: "Small ones deserve that, and I have no hire for the greater crimes." But Draco did nothing to alleviate the social inequality. Enslavement for debt was still commonplace, and to really throw gas on the fire, wealthy landlords routinely exported grain to other more profitable markets, thus further straining the food-producing capabilities of Attica. Compounded by the heavy and brutal laws that never quite seemed to punish the rich, Athens had fractured into 3 camps, if you will, depending on where you lived and your economic status. The men of the plain were the landowners, favoring a continuation of the oligarchic rule. The men of the coast could be seen as middle class, craftsmen and artisans, and favored a more balanced government. Finally, the men of the hill were the poorest farmers and inhabitants of Attica. They had suffered the most under the debt-to-slavery system and were after a democratic government where they could have a voice. Neither camp was really fond of the other, but all agreed civil war loomed unless something was done. Next to take on the challenge was the wealthy and educated statesman Solon. Appointed eponymous archon in 594 BC, Solon was liked by the rich because he came from aristocratic stock, while his reputation as wise and fair enamored him to the lower classes. He took the office with a simple task: make everyone happy and ensure no one kills each other. Well, I believe President Lincoln said it best when he reflected that you can never please all the people all of the time. To Solon's credit, he did his best to give each side support, but it seemed that for every law he passed, there was something to complain about from the other side. For instance, for the lower classes, he finally outlawed enslaving Athenians for debt, and he even managed to track down those who had been sold abroad. Somehow. No one's really quite sure how. And always the popular move, cancelled outstanding debts. Hooray! My favorite kind of lawmaker. Now this is great if you were in debt. Not so great if you were the debt holder. To compromise, Solon assured debt holders that the benefits of not having a massive social uprising outweighed whatever paycheck they would have received. And, bonus, you get to keep any land you've already seized. Which also means, sorry poor folk, you don't get your land back. Sorry about that. Solon also banned the export of any agricultural product except olive oil, which Athens produced in abundance. You could spin this as a national security sort of deal, in that in case there was a grain shortage, at least we could feed ourselves. And this really was great for the poor, which the soil of Attica could barely afford to feed anyway. But let's say I'm a wealthy grain merchant. Whatever I produce off my own land, I should be able to do whatever I want with. Well, to this Solon says, tough noogies. There's no real give and take thing here. Although to keep the wealthy happy, Solon continued the practice of reserving all the best government jobs for the top elite, thus ensuring archons would only come from the aristocracy. But then again, he also expanded some of the offices to include a wider range of participants from various family backgrounds, and permitted all male citizens, sorry ladies, regardless of economic status, to serve in the Helialia, basically a big jury that oversaw any case from simple civil matters to the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. I know that getting jury duty doesn't sound like that big an honor, but put it this way. The government is now recognizing you as a citizen, and this is one of the membership fees. If you want, we can go back to the old way, the one where you're one missed payment away from becoming a slave. There's that route too. Needless to say, this was a welcome move. Now, I'm not going to drone on anymore with the rest of his laws and reforms. After all, we've covered quite a few lawmakers in our time, but you can see that these back and forth measures at least attempt to satisfy everyone. Solon, commenting on his accomplishments later with a bit of poetry, wrote, "Such power I gave the people as might do, abridged not what they had, now lavished new. Those that were great in wealth and high in place, my counsel likewise kept from all disgrace. Before them both I held my shield of might, and let not either touch the other's right." Except, remember what Lincoln said, he can never please all of the people all of the time. Plutarch remarks, "When these laws were enacted, some came to Solon every day, to commend or dispraise them, and to advise, if possible, to leave out or put in something. Many criticized the laws, and desired him to explain and tell the meaning of such and such a passage. Knowing that to do so was useless, but not to do so would bring ill will, he was desirous to bring himself out of all straits and to escape all displeasure." In short, enough people bothered the heck out of him, and he bugged them in turn, and, wanting to leave on a high mark, Solon packed his bags and left Athens for 10 years. He claims it was to see if the city could adapt to his laws, but really, if he had stayed any longer, I think he would have had a nervous breakdown. On his sabbatical, he traveled to distant lands such as Egypt, where he learned the aforementioned tale of Atlantis, and also stopped by the Lydian kingdom to hang out in the court of King Croesus, whom you might recall met his end against Cyrus the Great. Yet for all Solon's efforts and attempts to reform Athens into a stable society, no less than 5 years after his departure, all the discontent bubbled up again. The wealthiest citizens were infuriated that they had been deprived of the debts owed to them, and many clung to their government positions, even refusing to step down once their term was up. For the poor, well, yes, the slavery issue had been dealt with, but there was a bigger problem. Serving in a jury is all fine and dandy, but this is the most participation in government they'll ever see. All the top positions are still the exclusive realm of the elites, and to add insult to injury, remember the Areopagus? That council that retired archons comfortably sit for life? They're exempt from the judgments of the Helialia, meaning that ultimately, really, very little has fundamentally changed. Well, enough's enough. The men of the hill, the camp of the poorer classes agree it's time for a radical shift in leadership. They can't bring back a king, no one would dare go for that, but there is the possibility of a tyrant. Someone who could wield total authority, bypass all those rotten old men's clubs, and do it all in the name of the people. And remember, tyrant has no negative connotations yet. It simply means someone who rules with absolute power. Exactly what was needed to break up the elite groups. To this they approach an Athenian general named Pisistratus, a war hero from a recent battle with the nearby city of Megara, and a man with a reputation as a populist. They offer to back him as tyrant of Athens, and he gladly agrees. But, how does one walk into a deeply ingrained bureaucratic oligarchy and announce you are now the boss of everyone? Why, theater, of course! This is Greece, after all. What better place to do so? In 561 BC, a bloodied and injured Pisistratus entered the Athenian agora, that's the marketplace, riding in a beaten-up carriage pulled by 2 wounded mules. People rushed to his side, shocked to see their popular leader in this state, and inquired as to what had happened. He explained that thugs hired by his political rivals did this to him, those scoundrels. Whether or not his injuries were self-inflicted has been theorized by numerous writers as early as Herodotus. To protect against further attacks, he needed bodyguards, preferably ones supplied at the taxpayer's expense, of course. The assembly, that group of male citizens, agreed to his request and voted to supply him with a personal cohort of club-wielding citizens. To which Pisistratus took them up the Acropolis and declared before all he was now tyrant of Athens. Ah, the old switcheroo. He rules for about 5 years before he's expelled by decree of the other 2 social groups, the wealthy men of the plain and the middle-class men of the coast. Their political alliance, however, does not last long thereafter, and the leader of the coast men, one Megacles by name, reaches out to Pisistratus, offering his party support if he'll just marry his daughter. The ex-tyrant agrees to return, although the staggering around bleeding technique isn't going to work again. He's going to need something way over the top, something so dramatic and silly that there's no way people would buy it. Or as Herodotus puts it, the Greeks have never been simpletons. For centuries past they have been distinguished from other nations by superior wits, and of all Greeks the Athenians are allowed to be the most intelligent. Yet it was at the Athenians' expense that this ridiculous trick was played. Pisistratus re-entered Athens riding in a fancy chariot, accompanied by musicians, dancers, armed supporters, and most notably, a tall woman dressed exactly as the goddess Athena, in full armor. As they drove through the town, his supporters shouted out how Athena herself was welcoming Pisistratus back into her city, and the people ate it up. He was appointed tyrant for the second time in 556 BC. Now I'm sure no one actually thought it was the goddess herself. Well, maybe a few really dense folk, but it must have been done with such finesse that no one would believe him to be a bad guy. But his re-entry into the city was predicated solely on the promise of an arranged marriage between himself and the daughter of the coast faction's leader. And when it came time to, seal the deal, Pisistratus wasn't up to the task. Megacles was furious at this insult and managed to unite all of the tyrant's enemies against him and exile Pisistratus from Athens a second time in 555 BC. Just a year after his return. That didn't last very long, did it? Except, hold your horses, dear listeners, the story's not over just yet. Over the next roughly 10 years, Pisistratus waited his turn, investing in gold and silver mines in Thrace and northern Greece, and they paid off big returns. Using this wealth, he was able to buy the support of many wealthy allies in the city and nearby areas, as well as a large mercenary army. The theatrics had gotten him diddly squat. Now it's time to fight. In 546, Pisistratus landed his army at Marathon and marched towards Athens, taking care to let everyone know his intentions. Farmers watched him advance towards the city, doing nothing to stop his progress. But Athens had obviously heard the news and had organized its hoplite soldiers against him. Pisistratus surprised the defenders by attacking midday in the hot Athenian sun, a time when heavily armored soldiers in metal suits aren't quite at their peak, and granted amnesty to any who laid down their weapons. They did so, and Athens, after 3 attempts, was finally his. The lower classes were happy to see their tyrant return and eagerly awaited his changes, while the wealthy elite begrudgingly accepted his rule. Would he be greedy and treat the city as his plaything, or go on an execution spree, drenching the city in blood? Maybe he would, or maybe he wouldn't be that bad. And you know what? For a tyrant, it turns out Pisistratus was a pretty decent ruler. To aid the lower classes who had stuck by him through thick and thin, he redistributed the land of certain elite families, and by certain, I mean his enemies, and allowed the poor to take out interest-free loans from the government. He encouraged an agricultural shift over to cash crops like olives and grapes, which he rightfully reasoned would enlarge the city's coffers. This was also followed with a simple 5 to 10% tax on all produce, which would be paid for with Athens' first silver coins, featuring the head of the goddess on one side and her owl on the reverse. To encourage economic growth, he funded a series of building projects, either paid for by himself or with the new taxes, and these included the first aqueduct into the city and the restoration of the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis. Pisistratus even promoted himself as a champion of culture, organizing festivals celebrating the works of Homer and commissioning the first written copies of the Iliad and Odyssey, creating definitive versions of the beloved tales. Under the tyranny of Pisistratus, Athens was peaceful and productive. Not exactly what you think of when you hear the word tyranny. So, was there anything bad about him? Well, he did pack government offices with his friends and supporters, gave away the land of his enemies who legally owned that land, he exiled the ones he really didn't like, and some have argued that the reason he kept things so peaceful was because an armed Athens might turn their anger against him. Yet when he died in 527, there was no chaos, no revolution. The tyranny simply passed on to his 2 sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, who ruled together as co-tyrants. The early years of their reign are without incident, mostly continuing their father's legacy and promoting the arts. But if their father ever entertained dreams of a golden era of Pisistratid rulers, well, he would have croaked earlier had he known how fast his hard work would unravel. In part 2 of our survey of Athens, we pick up with the end of the Pisistratid tyranny. Did it fall apart because of war? Finances? Glory? Or does it have everything to do with a lover spurned? To learn more about the ancient Greek music performed by Gregorio Paniagua and his musicians, visit harmoniamundi.com. Support their hard work by purchasing the album from iTunes, Amazon, or from wherever you get your music.